Nice to be here and talk with everybody and give some insights in terms of some of my experiences with respect to medical technology commercialization, how to come up with a need, and then future talks are really guided around how to action upon that need. But really, this is the base of where innovation comes from, is identifying a need. Now, before we go any further, I'm also on the Business Relationship Management Committee, which means I have to disclose all my conflicts. And certainly, Ahmed has already alluded to the fact that I do have some commercial interests with respect to medical technology development through Conavi Medical, some patents, as well as my own research in the field and activities in the field. We're going to talk a bit about what needs finding is, why is this important, how you can have multiple perspectives to needs are depending on who the stakeholder is, and just provide some high-level comments with respect to trends, where some resources are that might help you engage in the process of needs finding, and then the next step, which is screening through those needs to then decide what are the needs that you're going to address and act upon, and leave some time for discussion as well. Unfortunately, I probably have to leave at around 10 to 6, so I'll try and around 20 to 6 stop and see if we can save some time for questions there at that point. So medicine is a very interesting area. I used to be an engineer. I used to write software. I used to design circuits, come up with algorithms, do testing, debugging, and I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed having a toolbox and some skills that allowed me to solve some technological challenges. But what I found a little bit missing in terms of what I was looking for, in terms of the work I was doing, was related to not really knowing what the problems that I was trying to solve are. How did I know that debugging this particular software problem would lead to a clinical impact of some sort? Are there other problems that I should be working on that might be more worthwhile? And if you think of an engineer or a scientist or pretty much anyone in the healthcare field who considers themselves a problem solver in some way, shape, or form, you have a toolbox in terms of how to solve the problems. But what you need to do is walk into an environment that is abundant with problems, and you're pretty much in the middle of one right now. Sunnybrook has 1.2 million visitors a year, and they have problems, and that's why they're here. They're here to get them solved. And the people that work here and administrate this facility have problems that need those solved. And the people who pay for this hospital to exist has a lot of problems in terms of being able to continue to fund those activities. So if you were to look at where to invest some time to try and really come up with some new innovation that can have good societal impact, I think that the healthcare setting is a fairly rich one for that, for people to apply their skills to. And as society advances, I think that's going to be increasingly more so. We're going to spend more on education, we're going to spend more on healthcare, and some of the sort of day-to-day things that we have to spend on will be perhaps a little bit less of what we need to pay for in the future as we advance as a society. The people who are the needs clients include the patients. I think they should always be the most paramount. But as I mentioned, there are other stakeholders who have problems that need to be addressed, whether it's the physicians, the nurses, the technologists that work in the healthcare environment, the governments or the insurance companies or the patients themselves, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, how all of this gets funded and what can they afford, and how people actually go through the process of providing this, whether it's the emergency response system providing timely responsiveness, whether it's home care services after someone gets discharged, whether it's outpatient care, long-term facilities. There's a very broad spectrum that all relates back to healthcare, where there are an abundant number and spectrum of clients that need their needs addressed. So what is needs finding? If we define it broadly, it's the process of identifying how to improve the delivery of healthcare. And defining that, you can have a very broad approach to to identifying needs. You can really be very open-ended or open-minded. And as you gain insights through your career over time in terms of where some of the needs might be, then you might narrow down in particular areas that are of more interest to you. So just to give you an example, in our Medventions fellowship program, it's a 4-month fellowship. We have people do needs finding for the first 2 months of their fellowship program. And we try not to give them too much guidance in terms of what needs we want solved. We really want them to observe in the healthcare setting what are the needs through direct observation that they think are most important. But to say walk into the hospital with its 1 million square feet of space and 10,000 employees and then try and figure out what the needs are, it's a little bit too broad. So we narrow it down to a clinical area. We have one group this term who's doing cardiovascular medicine and another group that's doing musculoskeletal and orthopedics. So trying to narrow it down a little bit in order to have some focus, but you don't want to be too focused too soon. When you go through a needs finding process, you want to incorporate a lot of viewpoints. You want to get as many perspectives as you can in going through that process, and then really have a lot of discussions. Why was that particular observation related to a pain point? What would the impact of solving that pain point be on the physician, on the patient, on the healthcare system? And then as you narrow it down in some respects, then you might say, now that I've come up with some ideas around how, let's say, chronic pain might limit someone's ability to get out of an intensive care unit, and you really focus on that, and you say, well, if I came up with a solution, where else could I potentially broaden the application of that potential solution to in the future? And really that activity of, as I said, narrow down, identify your need, maybe come up with some candidate solutions, and then expand that solution to other needs where it could potentially carry over. That's something you really want to do at the later stage. You really want to make sure that your core need that you're addressing first is probably the main one that you focus on. There are some trends with respect to the kinds of needs that are out there. They used to be extremely diverse between geographies and populations and healthcare systems, and that certainly is very, very true. There still are dramatic differences with respect to how healthcare is performed in Toronto versus in large cities in New York versus in Japan versus rural communities in China. And so that diversity still exists, but it's becoming less so. It used to be that the US and Japan were premium healthcare and very little spared in terms of expense, in terms of how healthcare is provided for premium products. And then some parts of Europe were were more economically constrained. And then Canada kind of rode in between those two lines in terms of the provision and the expense that it would go to in terms of delivering premium healthcare versus balancing the economic constraints of how those systems are funded. And over the course of the past 10 years, there's been a dramatic equalization. It's not quite there yet, but certainly the United States has really been controlling its costs over the course of the past few years, whereas other jurisdictions have been kind of approaching closer to where North American healthcare is, especially if you look at India and China. There's been some dramatic changes there. And we're kind of at a middle point in terms of where that's happening. So the needs used to be extremely diverse, and they still are, but there is some equalization of that happening over time. There's more focus on cost effectiveness and objective measures for cost effectiveness within the healthcare system. So if you identify needs that can help make sure that a therapy or a treatment plan is effective, but also provide some cost benefits, that's extremely rewarding. When I started my residency as an internal medicine resident around 13, 14 years ago, I would look after patients who had severe valvular disease and they were in advanced age. And the surgeons would not want to treat them for their valvular disease because the risk of taking them to the operating room at the age of 80 to replace a heart valve was too high. Over the past 10 years, there have been a number of technologies that have come into broad clinical practice that allow people to treat aortic stenosis as a prime example of such a condition using minimally invasive technologies. And now we're doing replacements of those valves on patients who 10 years ago would probably not have lived another year or two. Okay, so we're really having a dramatic change in terms of how we treat people. A lot of these devices, whether it's cardiovascular devices, orthopedic devices, new medications, are allowing people who previously would not have been able to survive, frankly, they're now surviving. And they're having improved quality of life and improved longevity. But those solutions, they're not perfect cures. They result in other problems that come downstream. And so you have to anticipate, how do the new solutions that we bring forth in modern medicine, do those create opportunities or needs that need to be addressed perhaps 5 years down in the horizon? And so that's something that we're seeing more and more of in our clinical work. I think that there's a fair amount, there's always been a lot of patient and family involvement in decision making, but with the information becoming more easy to access for people, there's a lot more involved in terms of discussion around what the right therapies are, what the right devices are, did the doctor follow the right care pathway? And so you have a more educated patient and family group that is now able to have more discussions with physicians. And I think that the information technology era, which is very much upon us, is going to continue to have very substantial impacts in terms of the healthcare process. And to that end, artificial intelligence and the pervasive nature with which data is being acquired is certainly something that is also going to have a fair amount of impact on us. And then finally, these last two, I'm referring to some US-based acronyms, MACRA and MIPS, where hospitals and physicians are under dramatic pressure to show that they are delivering quality-based care, that they're not just getting paid for doing a procedure, but they're getting paid for doing that procedure well, with electronic health records, with good outcomes, with few complications, and in a very cost-efficient manner. And they're getting compensated with bonuses anywhere from +9% down to -20% in terms of their performance. And while some of this stuff is not enacted yet, it's coming in the horizon. And this is going to impact how medical technology is adopted over the course of the coming 5 years in a very dramatic and almost macroeconomic sense. So let's talk about a needs statement. When you have a needs statement, you want to talk about the core problem, who it's serving, who's going to benefit from this, and then what is the desired outcome. And I've got a few examples listed here, so I'll read them out. Address bleeding rates in patients undergoing cardiac surgery to reduce length of stay, transfusion requirements, and complications such as death and redo surgery. There, we've identified the core problem, the populations that are being served, cardiac surgery patients, and then what are we trying to do with a potential solution? If we address that need, how do we know we've addressed that need effectively? Note that the proposed solution is not actually part of what we said. We didn't say by giving them extra iron before they go in for their procedure, or by using a device that collects the hemoglobin from the surgical field and then recycles it back into the patient, or using specific techniques on how to do that. The solution's not there. It's more focusing on the need. What is it that you're trying to accomplish as opposed to how you're trying to accomplish it? There are a number of different ways that you could have solutions, and that's why you want to kind of step away from the solutions and just focus on the needs at first, and then you might contemplate various kinds of solutions as you have your list of needs that you want to address. And some of the solutions are technological in nature, whether it's a new medical device, a new drug, perhaps a new computer algorithm that improves some sort of imaging, new data sources and linkages, and I put that in there specifically because of the fact that we're becoming a very data-rich environment with respect to healthcare, and it's going to grow at an exponential pace over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. There's also process improvements where maybe you don't need a new device in order to achieve that objective. Maybe you don't need a new drug. Maybe if you did decide to go after a new drug or a new device, it might have to compete against new processes, or you might want to move that process forward because it might be a more effective way to address that need. And then I think just knowledge in general is a part of a way of providing solutions in terms of educating people, in terms of relieving anxiety, in terms of providing education to those where perhaps part of the problem or the need relates more to an educational perspective as opposed to a technological or a healthcare pathway approach. Whatever comes out of your needs finding process, and we'll talk about a few different ways to identify needs in just a moment, but whatever comes out of the needs that you identify is extremely important. Because if you decide that you're going to marry yourself in some respect or commit yourself in some respect to trying to solve an important healthcare need, it's not something you do in 3 weeks and then it's done. It's going to be a long-term commitment if you're going to do it effectively for the most part. And there certainly are exceptions, but to make change in healthcare, it requires generally a fair amount of investment in terms of funding, in terms of research, in terms of execution, in terms of regulatory things that have to be overcome, and in terms of cultural and educational aspects that have to be addressed. So when you decide that there's a need that you really want to address, especially if it's a need that's going to require a lot of resources to get it to a point where it will have clinical impact, you want to make sure you choose one that's very relevant and will continue to be relevant, because you're going to have to attract a lot of resources to that effort if you're going to be successful. So if you find a need and it really motivates you, it's getting support from others in terms of them wanting to join on to your mission, then you'll be able to have the necessary pull to drag those resources into that effort. And once you settle in on that need, there's an opportunity cost to that. And that opportunity cost is that there may be 5 or 10 or 20 other needs that you could have addressed more effectively, had a better impact, perhaps not have had to pull together as many of those difficult to find resources in order to accomplish. So what you really want to do, I've got a saying, life isn't part about speed, but it's more so about direction. And you really want to try and set that direction up early on so that you're going in the right direction, and sometimes the turtle wins the race over the hare. So that's the importance of needs finding. I'm going to talk about a few different approaches to how to find a need. One way is you can just walk up to somebody and say, what do you need? Ask a physician. What is it that you think would be the best thing to bring forward? I'm not sure what happened there. Let me pull that back up. There we go. And certainly it's an easy way to do it, but you might want to rethink that approach for a few different reasons. One, it's predicated on that individual knowing a lot more than you, which they very well might if they've been in the medical field for 20 or 30 years and have been involved in how to make change over the course of their career. But you might ask yourself, well, why aren't they doing this themselves? If there's a need here, why aren't they committing their own resources to it? And would they be willing to join in your effort if you, in fact, did start approaching that particular need that they've identified? I think that's a reasonably good filter. Whereas if they just say, no, come back and then tell me in 10 years when it's fixed, maybe there's a reason why they haven't gone after that particular need themselves. You might also ask, is this need in their mind because other people have tried this and they've failed this many times? And then other people have failed at addressing that need several times over in the past. And you might just ask yourself, all right, where are the gaps in terms of why this is a recycled need that hasn't yet successfully been addressed, as opposed to a newly found need that you might want to move forward with. And this whole approach of just asking someone for that need and then running away with it, it skips that process of going through giving yourself as many shots as possible before you decide which is the actual path that you want to pursue. So you can take these ideas that you get suggested to other people. You'll think it's good to add it to your list of potential needs that you might want to address, but I don't think you want to settle on just the first need that walks in the door. One thing that residents often do when they start their training is they ask me some questions around how do you identify the particular need that you want to work on. And when they come into their new clinical environment, they have a new level of responsibility. They're involved in a lot more patient interactions. They see a lot more about how the hospital operates. They get a lot of ideas coming to them. And what I recommend to them is that you write those ideas down on a piece of paper or on a phone or in a computer, and then you just store it. Don't look at it for a month. Think about it a little bit in the background. And if it still makes a lot of sense a month later, then maybe it's something to start paying a bit more attention to. But you'll find maybe 80 to 90% of those thoughts or ideas would have been deprioritized based on other things that you discover over that time period. Sometimes you can look up a need. There are a lot of people that say this is the need that we need that has to be addressed in the healthcare system. And that could be a marketing report. It might be a need statement put out by a healthcare association. It'll be often characterized in the literature to a certain extent. But you might want to just revisit that one a little bit as well, because sometimes these needs are often removed from the direct activity. In other words, it's written by people who maybe are watching at a very high level, but perhaps don't have their hands in the game as much. They're not as operational. And you really want to make sure that you're interviewing people both that have that high level view, but also getting understanding as to how is it that healthcare is being delivered in the trenches? What is it like in terms of the patient engagement, the experiences they're going through? I think that there's really value in terms of finding needs on your own, perhaps, less so than looking them up in the literature and then trying to select amongst those. The other thing is that once you've been able to look up a series of needs, that means there's an audience because it's published, and therefore a lot of other people will be addressing those needs, and that'll detract from the uniqueness of what it is that you're actually pursuing. There's the copycat approach, and this is done very frequently. In fact, it's funded fairly well too, in my mind. Where there's an area, it becomes hot, everyone wants the new valve technology, or everyone wants the new drug-coated stent technology, and there's kind of a hot area every 5 years or so where attention in the particular medical domain might move towards, and then all of a sudden you'll hear about 20, 30, 40 startup companies successfully being funded because one or two of them succeeded, got bought at huge valuations, and so all of the financing sources really got excited about that, and they wanted to be a second or third player in that field in order to move into an area that has a lot of attraction, has a little bit of momentum behind it. The downside of this is that you're not a first mover when you do a copycat approach. And it's being, again, influenced by data or opinions of others as opposed to you forming your own opinions and observations where you're really building the value at the very beginning stages by identifying the best needs. And then there's the approach which I'm a little bit guilty of, which is the be your own client approach. As a physician, I go through the hospital and I run into things that I wish I could address on a frequent basis, and I write down my ideas. And I do try and solve them and come up with new technologies, new devices that might potentially be helpful. And I think that it's a reasonable way to go ahead. I spent a long time in school. I was 40 years when I was done school. And so there's a fair amount of investments to be at the stage where you are practicing in healthcare in a subspecialty space. and able to get the experiences that would then really drive some of that. And it doesn't have to happen after you finish the educational process. It can happen long before then. But it does require a fair amount of involvement and dedication to get to that point before you're able to start churning out a lot of those ideas. There is a lot of motivation when a particular healthcare entrepreneur, and it doesn't have to be a physician, it can be a nurse, it can be a technologist, it can be anybody, but if it is your own idea and it is something that frustrates you, then you become your own client, which is great. Perhaps there's a risk of being a little bit isolated, not getting enough opinions from others as well in order to move that need forward. And the approach that I like the most is the direct observation approach. And that's really the fundamental of the Medventions Fellowship program, where we bring people in through the healthcare system. They're in an area that has some focus, but there aren't too many bounds in terms of what they should be writing down in their observations with respect to opportunities to identify things that need to be addressed. And I think that doing that in person as the primary source, going into an operating room, going into clinics, being on call, I think that that's a very good way to get some initial discussions. And then also going to secondary sources like conferences, webinars, and so on, where people talk broadly about areas, but then you can combine that with your own primary or direct observations, I think is a very helpful way to go. And when you take those observations and then you interview people within the healthcare system to learn a little bit more about their thoughts in various roles throughout the healthcare system, whether it's buyers, cath lab managers, nurses, people who refer to other people within the healthcare system for particular reasons, I think that you can build up a fair amount of information that perhaps they don't particularly have amongst themselves because they haven't done that horizontal sort of traveling to find out what each other is up to and what their thoughts are and what their particular constraints are in that clinical area. There's a lot that you can learn from the literature in order to provide yourself the necessary background information, in order to understand the language, and also to see where other people have succeeded and failed in terms of medical technology innovation. I think, as I mentioned before, speaking with the stakeholders to supplement your own direct observations is an extremely important way to go. So the way that you do this is you take notes, you show up with a notebook, you draw out workflows, you maybe act out some particular scenes in terms of how people work through the cath lab or in other environments in terms of the workflow of a situation, and see how is it that you can improve how things happen in that environment. And pay attention to when emotions shift in the course of a procedure. When is it that the physician's getting frustrated? When is it that the nurses are starting to pay more attention to some of the vital things because there's a little bit of anxiety building up into the room? And pay attention to when people are frustrated, because those are the pain points that you should be focusing on in terms of saying, is there a problem here that demands a need? And figure out where the failure points are. Why did this procedure not succeed? Why was there a complication? Why is the patient not happy with what happened in terms of discomfort? And why did it cost as much as it did? And then there's also the opportunity through direct observation to actually interact with some of the equipment and some of the workflows with some supervision from other people in the healthcare system as well, just to get your own sense of how they do their procedures. Build yourself a mock setup of how someone does an angiogram, just so you get a sense of how the catheters and different pieces of equipment work. And you'll actually learn a little bit about the equipment, the language, the workflow, and some of the challenges that they face when they end up doing their procedures. Interviews, when you do interviews, I think open-ended questions are a great way to go. You don't want it to be binary. You don't want it to be multiple choice. Really ask a little and hear a lot, and try and get a story from the group that you're interviewing so that you can really get a better sense from where they want to take you, as opposed to you directing them to spots where maybe you have some preconceived ideas about the needs or the solutions that you're trying to address. Attend rounds, going through the hospital to listen to the physicians and the nurses talk about patients as they round through. And multidisciplinary rounds can be extremely effective in that area. So patients, when they have cancer, there are these boards that will talk about the radiation therapy options, the chemotherapy options, the surgical options, and other aspects that relates to the holistic care of that patient in order to provide optimal care to that patient. You have some very different perspectives around how to look after patients with a particular condition. We similarly have something called the heart team rounds at Sunnybrook, where every time someone's being considered for a complex procedure, whether it's a surgical procedure or a minimally invasive procedure, we have rounds structured around there to make sure we get input from other people. And those are the tougher cases where you might find that there isn't quite yet a solution. And that's why they're coming to these rounds, because the interventionalists and the surgeons may not have identified the best way to treat a particular patient. You can also learn a fair amount by looking stuff up on the web. There are databases on the web run by the FDA and others where you actually have to keep track of any complications and publish complications with devices. And that's one example is the MAUDE database, which is the FDA-mandated database, where you can learn a bit more about what are the complications that are encountered in particular procedures. The Institute of Medicine puts out reports. Governments and insurance companies put out reports in terms of how they want quality-based care to move forward as well. You can walk through the stock rooms, walk through the inventory rooms, see what's happening. Perhaps you can talk to the people in the information technology group to find out why people are asking for different systems to support various stakeholders within the healthcare community. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, following the team on call, if you're at an academic hospital or at a 24-hour tertiary care hospital, is a really good way to get a really good sense of where some of the needs are, because some of the most serious problems occur at 2 in the morning. And the things that happen during the day, perhaps they're a bit more stable, a bit more elective, but you'll get a better sense of where some of the urgent situations are by following a call team around if you're given that opportunity. And you also want to seek a range of experience levels. I think that the young residents will be more apprehensive about some of the problems than some of the more experienced staff physicians. So they might say, why does this keep happening? Whereas the more experienced physicians might say, well, this happens all the time. And it's less of an obvious problem to them. But at the same time, very senior physicians might have more time to discuss things through, and they might have had a lot of experiences watching things succeed and fail over the course of their careers. And so I think that there's advantages to just talking to a broad spectrum of physicians in terms of their experience levels. Regardless of whichever approach you want to take, you want to make sure you invest a fair amount of time in terms of understanding what is the disease, what are the current standards of care, what are their limits, how do you approach those limits. And I think one example that comes up all the time in cardiology is that when someone's having a heart attack, we make their blood thin, but when we make their blood thin, then they have bleeding. And so we have these problems where we have bleeding versus clotting. And you really want to understand what are the trade-offs that make physicians decide what approach they're going to use under different circumstances for patients who might need more of avoidance of bleeding approach versus one that is more of an avoidance of thrombosis approach. And you want to learn about subpopulations that might be more difficult to treat than others. As an example, in this aortic stenosis example that I gave earlier, I think one of the reasons why TAVI, or transcatheter aortic valve implantation, became popular on a, not, I wouldn't say rapid basis, but on a decent pace basis, is because these patients with frailty and severe aortic stenosis didn't have a lot of options, and it was possible to innovate in that space because the alternatives were so bad. And I think that that allowed that particular space to move forward fairly quickly. You understand how complications are managed, and you understand how people train in order to perform in the work environment that they are in. So there's a fair amount to learn in the healthcare environment that just takes time to invest in, is important background knowledge. And that gives you the opportunity to also build the language or the lexicon and an understanding of the culture in the clinical environment in which you'll be interacting quite a bit as a healthcare entrepreneur. So if we look at clinical needs finding, there are a few aspects to it. As I mentioned, there's observation, background learning, firsthand familiarization, simulations, or acting. And then you want to take some of those ideas, synthesize them, distill them, work on some solutions, commit to them, execute, but then you have to circle back every now and then. And so this little red arrow here is a feedback loop where you might go back and do a bit more observation, get some more information, and then refine the approach as you go forward. It's not something that you do and then stop with a clean knife edge and then don't carry on with again in the future. In terms of the ideal person for needs finding, someone who's very open-minded, you want to be adequate, naive to be creative and observant. You want to be a good listener. You want to be able to draw a longer story out and be empathetic to the people that are telling you what their problems are. You want to understand those as fully as possible. But take notes, be reflective, have some good skills in terms of getting information out, know when they have the ability to spend some time to talk with you, but if they have to draw their attention to something more urgent, back off and let them approach the thing that is their number one priority at that particular time, especially if there's an emergency or a clinical workflow thing that has to be addressed. Understand how things work and how they fail. If you have a background in terms of how to build something and what works and what does not, that is helpful in terms of doing some early needs screening, not needs finding, but needs screening in terms of where there might be some viable solutions. And really it's an activity of being inquisitive, being resourceful, and ultimately committing some time to the task in order to do this. And that's why our Medventions Fellowship is a full-time commitment as opposed to a part-time commitment. And of course, persistence, resilience, and reliability are always helpful. Communicating well on a team is important, and it's hard to do this as a single person. If I step back to the first time that I really got involved in medical innovation, it was when I entered into a competition, an invention competition at Stanford, when I was an engineering student and about to become a medical student there. And there were probably 15 to 20 teams that competed in this competition on how to solve a better way to put blood vessels on the heart during surgery. And of those 15 to 20 teams, there were 3 that finished as finalists, first, second, third. And they were all teams, not individuals. You want to really have a team. I think that's something that's consistently observed, where you want to have a team and not just a particular individual that is bright and is the sole source of the information and is the only one that really contributes. You need a variety of skills, you need a variety of perspectives, you need a variety of personalities, and frankly, it's a lot of work. So you just need people as a team to move things forward, not just from the diversity, but also just from the amount of work that's required. And you have to take advantage of that team to divide and conquer the mass of the problems that lie ahead. You do want some mix in terms of the background, and it's useful to have people with a clinical background, perhaps a technological background, a business background, perhaps a statistics or an epidemiology background, and whatever it is. You just want to make sure that it's a complementary fit of people on your team that are able to help each other out. And of course, I think this last point is important, identifying people that you think are going to have a long-term commitment and be able to recognize each other's contributions and avoid what I call fractionation or in-team dissent, and really find people that are motivated by the clinical impact. Because if you find people that are in it to really make a difference as their #1 priority, then I think that you're more likely to succeed in terms of having a cohesive team in the long term. When you do go through the needs finding process, there are a number of biases that you'll be exposed to, and self-reporting bias or source bias is an important one. So if you ask a physician about the complications they have during a particular procedure, you might hear very little about those complications. And in part because we have a bias for remembering when things go well and perhaps less of a bias around when things don't go well. You know, you can ask a doctor, how do you cannulate the coronary sinus, which is a small structure that is in the right atrium? And some physicians will be like, yeah, that's easy. I get it done every single time. And there are others who will be like, yeah, it's a bit of a problem. They're always like, well, I let other people do that because it's not really my specialty. And then if you go and actually track them and watch them during procedures, you'll see that there are points of frustration. And maybe they get there, but it maybe takes them, instead of the 5 minutes or the 30 seconds that they told you that it takes to get to that particular anatomic structure, maybe it takes them 20 minutes or 60 minutes, and sometimes they have to abandon after 10 or 15% of the time. And you don't really get that from asking just one person, getting their impression. You have to watch and observe a few cases to see what the real occurrence is there. And you might also ask them about specific instances or occurrences rather than their typical or idealized case. So what happened the last time you tried to do this thing? And what is the worst situation that you encountered when you tried to do this procedure? Try and tease out some of those specifics in order to avoid that reporting bias that people as humans are generally prone to. Case selection. Some centers will do cases that are a bit easier than others because that's what they're equipped to do, that's what they're trained to do, and the more complex cases might be done at other centers or by particular physicians. And you want to make sure that you get a spectrum of what are the bread and butter cases and what are the complex cases. And so if I refer to cardiac surgery, there are some places that do standard bypass surgery, and then there are other centers that do complex congenital surgery, and they're very, very different in terms of the stories that you might get about how cardiac surgery in general takes place and what the needs are and what the patient populations are. So case selection is a definite source of bias. Also, a lot of the speaking happens from academic centers, and we are in an academic health center, and a lot of the new knowledge may come from academic health centers, but the reality is that 60 to 80% of tertiary medical care happens in the community setting, and things are certainly very different there, not just in terms of the kinds of procedures that are done there, but also in terms of how the places operate and what their areas of focus are. So you want to understand how things happen. If you're addressing a particular need, you don't want it to be solely isolated to the academic environment. You want to take into consideration some exposure in the community environment as well, whenever you possibly can. And you often hear that the way that I do this procedure is the only way that this procedure is done. And that often devolves very quickly when you talk about a hospital down the street or a hospital in another country. And sometimes even the physician next door will do things very differently. So there are a lot of procedures and a lot of treatment and medical care that happen in very divergent or heterogeneous ways. And in order to get an adequate sample size, you really want to make sure that you ask enough, you want to make sure you get an adequate sample size in terms of opinions on how people approach particular problems or what the problems that they are encountering are. There's also what I call the land of unchallenged assumptions, and there will be a lot of key opinion leaders that provide very strong opinions about how things are. And if you say, this one person told me this, and you latch on for the next year to that person's particular advice without getting some second source information from other people, that can be a bit distracting and perhaps even not as relevant to others that are doing a lot of the procedures that need that you want to get exposed to. There's something called observer bias, where something happens just because you're there watching it. There's what I call animation bias, because every medical device company, when it's in its early infancy, will have an animation that shows the perfect way that that perfect device fits in the anatomy with no fault and no complications. And you know, it's a way to make a procedure look too easy and become too excited about something early on. And then there's, as I mentioned, I think localization bias. How do we do things here versus how are they done elsewhere in the world, and their relevance. I just want to touch briefly on some, as an example of bias with respect to problem statements defined by others. So CAHO is the Council of Academic Hospitals of Ontario, and I hope I don't get a call tomorrow for being in trouble about this, because I'm going to be a little bit critical. But it's a council in Ontario that said, we're going to identify the 14 things that we want to address. And so they had all sorts of great things, like we want fewer admissions, reduced readmissions, patients to be more involved in their care, medication safety and minimize adverse events, coordinate clinical care for complex patients, manage frailty, strengthen information transfer between hospitals, enable communication between patients, families, and caregivers, reduce hospital-acquired infections, be ready for pandemics, and a number of others that come up. But when this was published, I asked myself, isn't the main goal to let people live longer and let people live better? And I didn't see anywhere amongst those goals improve the survival of people who come to hospital. It just said, make sure that they don't come back. And it didn't really talk about how do we make people feel better after a particular surgery. Did we treat their arthritis in a timely fashion? And while a lot of these things are embedded there in that series of problems that they've announced, there are other people that maybe don't prioritize that as well. And certainly patients might prioritize living better and living longer more so than perhaps the hospital administration might. And the hospital administration has a very difficult situation where they have to manage a large number of patients in a confined number of resources, and so they're focused on how to do that more effectively. But perhaps sometimes the focus gets lost from how do we make people live better and how do we make people live longer. In terms of the early screen after you've done your needs finding, the goal is to be open-minded, so you don't want to screen out ideas too soon. But after some period of time, you're going to have to start thinking, you know, I can't do all 100 needs that I identified over a 1 or 2 month interval. I'm going to have to start narrowing down on some of these to start moving towards a solution. And so you want to find something that's significant, and if it's something that's going to require a lot of funding, you probably want something that has a very large market opportunity of $1 billion, because you will need to attract money to solve that problem, and it's hard to do so unless that opportunity is a very large opportunity or a very strategic opportunity. It has to have an appreciable and preferably a quantifiable or measurable impact. The cost effectiveness analysis is something that increasingly plays more and more roles in terms of how the hospital runs. And so if you have something that's quantifiable, that's very, very helpful. You want something that's very broadly relevant. You don't just want to solve the problem that one physician encounters at their particular site. You want something that you can do in Canada, the US, Japan, China, Europe, around the world. Because if you solve an international problem, then you'll get a lot more opportunity to increase the size of the market that you're addressing and increase the clinical impact of the solutions that you generate. You want something that's personally motivating to you. And if you can find a solution that you think might if you have a need and a preliminary solution that you think could potentially be something that has a reasonable regulatory pathway, would be something that you could teach to people in a reasonable time manner so they can adopt it comfortably and ultimately save money for the healthcare system. These are all things that make a particular need and its paired solution more attractive. And so there is some formality around the needs finding and screening process, and I'm just gonna, we're gonna have these slides available and I'll just go through them slowly in the interest of time so I can open up for a few questions from people. As you look at various needs, there's a certain amount of risk associated with trying to address those needs. If you're trying to do something that's going to have a significant clinical outcome that'll be proven in a randomized, multi-center clinical trial, then the risk and the resources required to that are going to likely be quite substantial. And if you get to something that's perhaps more towards focusing on just reducing costs, then the amount of resources required, if it's more of a Me Too thing, then the risk is going to be lower, but the reward might potentially be lower as well. I think what we'll do is move to the summary. And that needs finding, it's an important step. It really does set the tone for an era where you might be investing a fair amount of time and effort into. It's a great opportunity for learning, for personal development, for getting familiar with the environment in which you're working, and also learning from your teammates in a needs finding group, so that you learn about what other people's perspectives and skills and backgrounds are. It focuses your efforts towards providing value, and done well, it can have a huge influence on your future impact. And so I wanted to thank you for your attention and draw on any questions that might be around for the next 10 minutes. And I do apologize because I do have to leave in 10 minutes for my flight. I'll be in trouble. Yes?
One of the things you mentioned was that a lot of the care, tertiary care especially, happens outside of the academic health center. So I was just wondering what your thoughts on incorporating ideas around localization would be in medical space, and how where along the needs finding / solution finding pathway that can be incorporated. You have it.
In terms of moving into the community and getting those opportunities to learn.
Yeah, especially in a non-academic hospital setting.
Yeah, and so there have been actually a few initiatives recently here in Toronto, even, where a few of the community-based hospitals have banded together on an innovation agenda, and they're starting to attract some resources to try and enable this. And certainly we've had discussions with some hospitals through the Medventions program and how we're trying to expand the fellowship program to provide opportunities for people to go to other sites in order to get that exposure. And part of it comes from being involved in industry. One of the great ways to see a lot of cases at a variety of different centers is to represent a particular product and then move and watch the clinical scenario in multiple different places. And so you'll often find that they have actually a really good sense of how things are done at different hospitals because they have that doorway open to them. It's not an easy doorway to open. For us, in terms of our fellowship program, we are trying to create those opportunities in the future. We haven't quite done it yet, but getting those opportunities for people to not just be in the academic center, but also in more of the community-based centers for their needs finding efforts. You had a question as well?
Yes, the localization bias.
Mm-hmm.
You said that it's best to test yourself by going to other hospitals in the country, in areas around you.
Yep.
Are health professionals willingly divulge this sort of information to you?
So the question is, with respect to localization bias, how do you go about getting more international experience in interacting with healthcare professionals from other jurisdictions? Is that a fair paraphrasing of your question? The conferences are a good way to do that. We get a lot of people coming to North America for international conferences, and you will find some opportunities to get that experience. Some people, we're very diverse here, and so a lot of people in Toronto have friends and relatives who are practicing healthcare around the world, and sometimes you can make connections that way. And you're going to have to start to a certain extent with respect to your own local community to figure out what your initial needs are going, and it's more of a confirmatory approach that you might want to take, where after you've built up your own initial knowledge base and initial assessment of what some of those needs are, you then want to reach out, and a lot of the people in your local community will have people that they can connect you with internationally that would be able to provide that kind of advice through introductions. Okay. Any other questions? I got time for maybe two more. Yeah.
In medical devices, I've heard, so here's my question, I wrote it down. As a physician and an engineer, how do you convince others within your circle and your physically interventional cardiologists to follow your lead?
So the question is, if you're a physician entrepreneur, how do you get other people to then follow, to consider the solutions that you've generated? Okay. I think you discuss it to them, you show it to them, and then you try and get them to provide an honest opinion about whether or not they think it's worthwhile. And you know, if you generate something that truly is of value, then you will get their interest. And there isn't really much of a trick to it. It's more, if you've done a good job of listening, if you've come up with a good technological solution or pathway solution or knowledge solution that might help them move improve their healthcare, they probably have the same goals as you do, and so they'd be interested in at least contemplating trying it out. And one of the things that I've done is I've actually moved most of the testing for any of the technologies that I work on outside of the hospital here, in order to make sure that there's some independence in that process, as opposed to doing a lot of it within the building that I work with and have multiple important clinical relationships with, just to maybe get some further autonomy, a bit more independence, and perhaps get a bit more credibility outside of the institution from a third party. It's a bit more independent. Yes.
So in Canada, the third leading cause of death is actually medical errors, right? Why do you think there isn't a higher sense of urgency to invent and to look at health and better healthcare systems than engineering?
So the question is, with medical errors being purported as 1/3 of the causes of deaths within hospitals, why is there not more urgency behind that? I think there is a fair amount of urgency behind that. You know, not everything goes well when you're in a hospital, and so people come to you, they're sick. You're typically trying to reverse a train that's going off the cliff, as opposed to diverting a train that's taking a nice leisurely stroll through the mountains. You're in a situation where problems are bound to happen, and people are going to make mistakes because mistakes happen. But there is, I think, some reasonable efforts happening with respect to creating a culture that is accepting of error, that acknowledges error, and that tries to address the errors. There's certainly a principle of no fault in terms of reporting. If you report something, it's considered a good thing. It's not considered a vindictive thing that you're doing against a coworker. It's really geared towards trying to improve the delivery of care. There are quality-based reporting rounds, which are protected environments where physicians and other healthcare professionals discuss things that did not go well in order to try and address them to prevent them from happening in the future. And there are increasing safeguards that are happening in terms of how the systems work to prevent people from making common mistakes, with standardized order sets, certain checkpoints before you do certain therapies or provide certain medications. So there's a fair amount around that. But as you can imagine, with 1.2 million visitors at this institution alone every year, there's certainly opportunity for error, and it can certainly some of them can be quite fatal. So I think that the culture's changed quite a bit in the past 10 years. Physicians are strongly encouraged and are now protected when they say, "I'm sorry" to a patient or to a family. We're encouraged to acknowledge that when we make mistakes with our patients and to their families, and I've had fatal errors that I've made, that someone has died in my hands, and I've been able to explain that to the family. And it creates some trust that, you know, this is not what we intended. We wanted to do something better. I think that trust relationship is a really important one to preserve in terms of not only acknowledging that there are errors, but then addressing them and providing opportunities to have some discussions and motivation around trying to prevent them in the future. So one of the steps is just acknowledging that, yes, there are mistakes that happen. There are things that can be avoided. And I do think the culture is changing in a favorable way in that respect. Okay. Thank you very much.
I was going to check if someone online. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Just a very quick announcement. So the next lecture is on Thursday, September 21st. We're having Mr. Robert Harrison, the R&D manager, spine division from Bayless Medical, and he's going to use the Bayless Medical as a case study to walk us through how to approach medtech entrepreneurship. The other lecture is on Thursday, September 28th, and we're having Dr. Harold Woodlinger, President Woodlinger Consulting, it's right here, and he's going to tell us more about how to the kind of business modeling in models in medtech. Once again, thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.